In recent months, some analysts have recommended looking for companies with solid cash flow and putting aside growth stocks with no earnings that trade at 30-40 times revenue.
Fair enough, but what about stocks that have achieved consistently strong growth, trade at barely more than 0.5 times revenue, and have achieved positive cash flow? That is Decibel Cannabis's position, but how did they get there? Well, over the last year and a bit, all pot stocks have been completely destroyed. This is because they generally have very poor earnings results, and there's been a malicious short that's been selling everything, the good and the bad. I'll do a separate video on that aspect of it, but the fact of the matter is, there are solid companies that got sold off as if they're terrible companies. What many people don't understand is that cannabis is not a commodity. There's good and there's bad. It's more like wine than it is beer. There's some terrible beer out there that nobody wants to drink, but the difference between really good beer and just average beer, it's not that huge. Whereas wine, rich people will pay hundreds of dollars a bottle, even more, and they'll spin around their glass and they'll look at it through the light and they'll smell it and all this kind of stuff, and they'll go on and on and on about the various aromas and flavors and whatnot. And this is coming from a guy who doesn't drink wine and occasionally drinks beer. But, yeah, weed is more like wine than it is beer in that sense. And the fact that Decibel Cannabis is good at growing weed explains their earnings performance. This is an overview of the last 8 earnings reports from Decibel Cannabis. How specifically did they achieve such strong growth? The initial move is due to the fact that they were, as far as I know, the first to come out with weed that came in at 30% or better THC being the active ingredient, and nobody else was able to do that at the time. Because of that, they were able to sell a lot of weed for $60 or even more in some cases, an eighth of an ounce. But here you see one quarter where revenue actually declined a little bit. Why is that? That's because the competition really stepped up, and all of a sudden there were quite a few companies out there selling maybe not 30+% THC weed, but pretty good weed at a much better price. How did they get back to strong growth? They invested heavily in concentrates, which is an underserved market, and they became dominant within that. So far, I've been fairly vague about what makes Decibel the best pot stock out there, and I'll make a series of videos in the not-too-distant future about Decibel specifically, and other pot stocks as well, some of which are good, and you will see that yes, Decibel is currently the best play out there. But you can't argue with results. And focusing on Decibel's latest earnings report shows you just how undervalued this stock is. So in their quarter, ending with June, they grossed about $26.25 million. Then they have excise tax, because they're a cannabis company, and that comes right off the top. So that left them with about $18.5 million. Then you have fair value adjustments, and those don't matter. I might discuss that more in a future video, but for now, we can just say they don't really matter. Then their cost of production was a little over $10 million, leaving them with about $7.7 million in gross margin. Then their general and administrative expenses were about $4.8 million. Their depreciation and amortization was a little over $1 million. Their share-based compensation was $862,000. Their financing costs were $808,000. And their losses on foreign exchange were $152,000. And I doubt that was even realized. It's just on paper, probably, but they don't really specify. And then they had unspecified gains of $47,000. Now, if you add all that up, they made $89,000. Depreciation and amortization accounts for capital expenditures which have already been spent. Yes, these are expenses that need to be accounted for, but it does not affect their current cash flow. Share-based compensation is the issuing of stock options, and if exercised, will affect their valuation, but for now, it does not affect their cash flow. I may discuss that more in a future video on valuation, but for now, that is the main takeaway, is that it does not affect their cash flow. I don't know whether or not their loss on foreign exchange was realized, so we can include that just for the sake of being conservative, and exclude their $47,000 on unspecified gains, and you come out with a positive cash flow of about $1.8 million. A less bright spot for them is their debt. At $85 million, that is fairly high, and that includes $36 million in accounts payable. And that actually increased quarter over quarter. Their accounts payable went from $33 to $36 million. Did they buy more equipment on credit? Did they defer payments? I'm not too sure. However, their cash and accounts receivable did increase more than their debt did.
But when you consider that they recently refinanced their debt, making it longer term and lower interest, and that has already affected their financing costs, bringing it down to $808,000 from approximately $1 million a quarter in the previous 6 or 7, and you look at their positive cash flow and their growth prospects, that debt seems pretty manageable. So what are their growth prospects? I'll make a video very soon in which I read some of their product reviews. But for now, suffice it to say that at the beginning of this year, they started announcing that they had record market share every month. And they showed December of last year as having 3.6 national market share. This last quarter, ending in June, saw 4.4% market share, in June specifically, not the whole quarter. And what did July see? Well, it went up to 4.5%. So it's looking like their next quarter is going to be more revenue heavy, especially when you consider that it's a growing market. What will happen to Apple, Google, Johnson & Johnson, the broader market over the next few days, weeks, months? Well, that's really difficult to say. But what's going to happen to a tiny company with a fairly long track record of strong growth, has increased their market share in the current quarter, has positive cash flow, and is being valued at barely more than half a year's worth of revenue? Now that is something to consider.